So Kate is a Britain alum and an affiliated researcher at Georgia Tech, and she came to us from Carnegie Mellon, where she earned a PhD in literary and cultural studies. Prior to this, she earned a BFA in fine art and a bachelor's in English from the University of Cincinnati. She's continued to engage with the intersection of visual culture and literature ever since, and her research into 19th and early 20th century British literature, visual culture, digital humanities, and the history of science spans traditional and digital formats. So when she was here at Georgia Tech, she developed and launched the digital archive visualhaggard.org, which is a literary and art historical resource. And she's also published articles in American periodicals, Configurations, Digital Humanities Quarterly, English Literature and Transition from 1880 to 1920, the Journal of Victorian Culture, the Journal of the History of Biology, and Victorian Network. She translated her interdisciplinary work during her years of the postdoctoral fellowship into first position as a UI developer, and then into her current role as an industry analyst for Redmond. She continues to research and publish widely as an affiliated researcher, and also to advise current fellows on translating research and teaching skills into multiple professional contexts. And we're here today to celebrate her first monograph, Illustration in Fin-de-Siècle Transatlantic Romance Fiction. This resource explores the multimodal synergy of the Fin-de-Siècle romance form through analysis of the collaboration between graphic artists and authors. And I'll hand it over to Kate to tell you more about her work.
All right, yeah, this is so exciting. So thank you to everyone who's able to make it. I think one of the, I wouldn't say a good thing, but one of the things that we can take advantage of in these times is, being able to do asynchronous and synchronous work together, and also that I'm able to bring together folks from all over. So, I'm just very grateful to have you here with me. And yeah, again, this will be recorded. So, for folks who can't make it, we'll be able to share that. So what I propose doing, since we have a little bit of time, is just kind of doing some thank yous. I just want to spend a little time with my acknowledgements page before I move on. Then I'm going to play a video which starts with me giving a little overview of the book, some of my major arguments, and what's also nice about the video recording format is I was able to intersperse some illustrations, so you'll have something to look at besides just my talking face. But then we have 3 guest speakers, and I just arranged them by the chapters that they're mainly going to focus on. So I begin with Richard Hill, who's going to talk about my chapter on Robert Louis Stevenson, then Toby, who's going to talk about the chapter on H.G. Wells, and then finally Ian Afflerbach, who is here with us already. I think Toby's going to be dropping in here soon. Who's talking about my 5th and final chapter, and it's the one that really gets into the transatlantic part of my book. So I lean heavily on my Americanist friends, since that is not my pedigree. So he will be speaking to that. Okay, so I just wanted to begin by kind of giving some background about where this project came from. So many of you know, run an archive called Visual Haggard, started it in 2013, and it really was my first exposure to illustrations in a really meaningful way. I think, like many of us, I had seen a few illustrations of sort of the canonical works, and I just assumed that was all there was. And what I became really impressed with was the number of iterations that illustration history actually kind of foregrounds. And so I just really had no idea about how many illustrations had been made. And these illustrators were really kind of writing the plots themselves. So that experience really kind of opened the door for me, looking at other authors and seeing how that kind of translated in other ways. So the book kind of gets into how different periodicals would crop these illustrations. So even though you think that it's the same illustrator and you're just kind of getting the same experience no matter where you're reading it, you'll see that the editors at Cosmopolitan would edit these images to fit their format differently than other periodicals. So and a lot of times that actually had to do with what side of the Atlantic they were on. So so that was an important part of telling the story. Okay, so in terms of forming that particular project, which has been sort of building for many years, I'm extremely grateful to Nines for their referees. They gave me some excellent feedback, as well as Catherine Golden, who read a draft of the editor's statement and really kind of pushed me into illustration studies. I wasn't really familiar with that whole realm, and she opened that door up for me. So grateful to her. Also grateful to my friends at Georgia Tech. So the Britain Fellows, were not only great supporters of this project, helped me with earlier drafts, or helping me today, but also I did a lot of the research as a Britton Fellow, and then as I transitioned into an affiliated researcher and was able to maintain my library status. So I especially want to give a shout out to Glenna Barney from the Interlibrary Loan Department, because I could not have done this if I didn't have access to these more obscure texts. So then I certainly want to thank the readers that I had the pleasure of interacting with at Routledge. So, thanks to all the editors there, as well as some of my friends who had, experience or the good graces to read some of these earlier chapters. So that has certainly includes my friend Maggie Dimmick, Richard Hill, Toby, and then the readers at American Periodicals who published an earlier draft of my 5th chapter. I especially want to thank Alfred Haft at the British Museum, who was able to help me identify a Rudyard Kipling reference, who he had seen a Hokusai print when he was traveling in Japan, and he was able to help me track that down. So thanks to him. Also want to thank many of my friends at NAVSA who were able to speak to me about this project. So that includes Paul Fife, Alison Headley, Lorraine Jansen-Kustra, Nicole Lobdell, Roger Whitson, and Adrian Wisnicki. And then I had a heavy correspondence during this project, since it did take place, of course, during the pandemic. So Ian Afflerbach, Tora Brilo, Rachel Dean Rosnica, Julia Thomas, and Todd Thompson, who all, I exchanged emails with throughout this process. So, okay, so on that note, I will transition then to the asynchronous part of this presentation and share the video, which will give you some background about my project, and then we will move into Q&A after that. All right.
Although horrors and wonders exceeding the bounds of human perception and understanding were conventional in late Victorian and Edwardian romance fictions, the illustrations which appeared beside these marvels suggested that, when it comes to visual paratexts, quite the opposite was thought to be the case. My book, Illustration and Fin-de-Siècle Transatlantic Romance Fiction, examines illustrations created to accompany several of the most popular and wild-minded fictions published between 1885 and 1920. When Fin-de-Siècle illustrators undertook the task of illuminating moments that novelists left opaque, artworks challenged these wonders' supposed inexpressibility. Illustrations round out the reader's aesthetic, narrative, cultural, and emotional experience, and therefore can never be mimetic reflections of authorial intent. Artists are justified in creating extremely imaginative and pan-referential pictorial interpretations of indescribable moments that invoke a range of subject matter, including nature, advertisements, fine art, and other illustrations, industrial blueprints, and theatrical productions, to name just a few common allusions. A robust and synthetic literary, art history, cultural studies, and print history lens is therefore necessary to make sense of these layered histories. In this monograph, I contend that Fin-de-Siècle romance fiction illustration offers an exercise in interdisciplinary thinking that, while formidable, opens up these texts to considerable aesthetic and sociocultural insight. Both realist and romance fictions were illustrated during the late 19th century for their initial serializations, but there is good reason to focus on romance illustrations particularly. The romance revival was tremendously visual, not only because of illustration's ubiquity, but also owing to the type of wonders described. Readers were struck by romance fiction spectacles, which profoundly surpassed the reader's lived experiences. Robert Louis Stevenson points to the form's optic qualities in A Gossip on Romance, explaining that a good story must, quote, repeat itself in 1,000 colored pictures to the eye. Tableaus of wonder made deep and lasting impressions upon audiences. Indeed, Graham Greene notes that H. Rider Haggard's fictions, quote, fixed pictures in our minds that 30 years have been unable to wear away. The illustrations which accompanied these fictions did more than mimetically reproduce romance's visually impressive supernatural wonders, advanced technologies, violent battles, great feats of heroism, and titillating romantic trysts. By engaging the notion of inexpressibility, these graphic paratexts deepen romance fiction's plots. In H. Rider Haggard's She, for instance, narrator Horace Hawley and his adult ward Leo Vinci journey to darkest Africa in search of the immortal and supernaturally powerful Queen Asha, or She Who Must Be Obeyed. Although wonders and adventures occur throughout, one of the most frequently illustrated portions of She shows Hawley pondering a white, mummified foot. This dismembered and perfectly preserved appendage is all that remains of a beautiful mummy that Bilali, the adventurer's Amahagger guide to Asha's kingdom of Kor, had become enamored with in his youth. In fact, it was Bilali's mother who burned all but this mummy's extremity to end her son's unnatural infatuation. After learning the foot's remarkable history, Hawley explains that he, quote, took this cold fragment of mortality in my hand and looked at it in the light of the lamp with feelings which I cannot describe, so mixed up were they between astonishment, fear, and fascination. This supernaturally unspoiled foot, its appearance, materiality, and history, resonates so deeply with Haggard's narrator that verbalizing or even processing his complex emotions becomes impossible. It touches on something much deeper than horror or antiquarian interest. Although Haggard leaves the substance of the foot's mystery open to the interpretation of readers, artists beginning with E.K. Johnson, the illustrator for the Graphic and Harper's Weekly's serializations, and followed by Charles Kerr, co-illustrator with Maurice Riefenhagen for the 1888 Longmans London book edition, have sought to convey its power and seductiveness. What made Haggard's illustrators not only willing, but also eager to show a marvel that Haggard will not, and Hawley, quote, cannot describe? Indescribable scenes, like this eerie drama in She, energized illustrators of Fin-de-Siècle romance fictions. Rendering fictional technologies, lands, creatures, peoples, and circumstances graphically allowed these artists to add both concrete detail and greater mystery to these incredible stories. That illustration plays a pivotal role in marketing fictions to middlebrow consumers is well understood by scholars, but less research has been devoted to interpreting these visual paratexts as they appeared in romance fiction. Building upon the research of 19th century visual culture and illustration studies scholars, I argue that by making the marvelous visible, illustrations perform an invaluable function to the construction and reception of this literary form's plots. I focus on romance fiction because these texts were visualized despite, or perhaps because, authors explicitly wrestled with ideas of ineffability. Far from being put off by wild visions of terror and wonder, portraying incidents characterized as surpassing the author's or narrator's expressive abilities invigorated artists. Whether on purpose or accident, by including indescribable marvels, authors granted their illustrators near total liberty to fill in gaps in the reader's understanding. These unimaginable moments permit word and image to labor hand in hand, deepening the audience's engagement with a text's more profound themes. Illustrations alerted audiences to potentialities underlying the technological marvels, magic spells, terrible monsters, and far-off places boilerplate to the era's most wild-minded fictions. Because romance deals largely with imagined worlds, the meaning and importance of this imagery calls for close examination. The dichotomy between word and image has long troubled humanist critical theorists within the fields of literary, art history, and cultural studies. Scholars concerned with text and image's relationship to the construction of meaning increasingly reject the, quote, window theory of illustration, which suggests that visual paratexts show what an author writes transparently. The notion that artists and authors jointly produce the plots of illustrated texts has become particularly persuasive. Illustrated romance fictions are especially successful at moving beyond imitation because they prescribe wonders beyond the everyday and even outside of nature. By incorporating pictures, publishers transmute fictions into complex, multimodal, and collaborative cultural artifacts. The methodology I use for this project addresses a significant aspect of the graphic history of romance fictions. By focusing on the iterative illustration history of canonical romance fictions, my project contributes much-needed historical detail to the single publication-focused studies of other scholars. More scholarship must be devoted to the fact that within the first decade of their serialization in illustrated periodicals, H. Rider Haggard's She, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and H.G. Wells' War of the World were all illustrated again and again by several different artists for subsequent publications. While literary critics have noted the significant revisions these authors made to their fictions prior to appearing in book form, by amending errors and expanding upon hastily made ideas, less attention has been paid by illustration studies scholars to the iterative history of these and other canonical romance fictions. Yet these novel visual accompaniments were more than a marketing tactic. New illustrations had the effect of remaking texts. No wonder authors often preferred the illustrations of some artists above others. Maurice Griefenhagen's illustrations for Haggard's She, for example, appealed to the novelist so strongly that he hung several in his Norfolk home, an honor not afforded to the fiction's first illustrator, E.K. Johnson, or Griefenhagen's co-illustrator for the Longmans edition, Charles Kerr. My project engages these histories by studying multiple illustrators' approaches to visualizing an author's texts. By examining several artists' interpretations of the same scene, theme, or character, I expose how and where illustrators understood these fictions differently. As Georges du Maurier asserts, quote, "The humble illustrator has a right to his opinion, since he has sometimes to read and reread fictions so carefully." A comparative illustration study helps researchers better understand what persons during the Fin-de-Siècle believed called for graphic representation. By uncovering representational patterns spanning, intersecting, and doubling back between several artists and fictions, my inquiry identifies not just the hobby horses of particular illustrators and authors, but also, and more importantly, pictorial formulas which these sometimes unwilling, multimodal collaborators came to rely upon, and audiences came to expect. My monograph is divided into 5 chapters, focusing on a single author, genre, and theme. Each will begin with a broad history of illustration within the genre, but then focuses on one canonical late 19th century author as a case study. Chapter 1 examines how unimaginable because bygone eras appeared in Robert Louis Stevenson's historical romances Treasure Island and The Black Arrow. Chapter 2 examines the pictorially resistant convention in children's fiction of expressive animals in Rudyard Kipling's Her Majesty's Servants, Tumai of the Elephants, and How the Camel Got His Hump. 2 stories from the Jungle Books, and 1 from the Just So stories, respectively. The 3rd chapter explores several indescribably powerful and sexually alluring African women from H. Rider Haggard's adventure fictions, focusing particularly upon the characters of Nania from Blackheart and Whiteheart, Maiwa from Maiwa's Revenge, and Asha as she appeared in the She franchise. Chapter 4 surveys and assesses pictures of incredible technologies from several of H.G. Wells' fictions, including In the Abyss, The War of the Worlds, When the Sleeper Wakes, and A Story of the Days to Come. Fanciful machines often defy description, either owing to the narrator's inability to characterize them faithfully, or else because they were too advanced to describe using 19th century analogies. The final chapter examines illustrations that engage the unspeakable horror of cannibalism conducted by and upon supposedly civilized white persons, focusing particularly on Harper's Weekly's serialization of James DeMille's Imperial Gothic romance, A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. Illustration in Fin-de-Siècle Transatlantic romance fiction sets out to investigate literary, historical, cultural, and aesthetic clues illuminating how images in the late 19th and early 20th century romance fiction form enabled artists to visualize wonders thought to surpass or somehow thwart human description. In the process, I point to the innovative collaborations that authors, illustrators, and publishers forged to describe the ostensibly ineffable. My project studies illustrations created to enhance late 19th and early 20th century British and American romance fiction plots, incorporating magic, technology, desire, violence, and other marvels that thwart written representation, because these multimodal texts provide illustrators with the dual burden and opportunity of visualizing unspeakable ideas. I endeavor to better understand the complex bonds joining word to image in order to plumb what romance illustrations of indescribable marvels can and do accomplish.
Hello, I'm Richard Hill. I'm here to congratulate Kate on her book and to help with this launch of what I think is a really significant contribution to illustration studies. I had the good fortune to help, or at least discuss, the illustrations of Robert Louis Stevenson last year. And she provided me a draft chapter that I was really happy to read and just provide a few more notes on, not much, honestly. So I'm really happy to be able to contribute to this, to what I think is an excellent book. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Stevenson because that's all I'm really qualified to talk about. But I'm really delighted that Kate's picking up the discussion on Stevenson illustration, because my work focused on those illustrations that he himself was part of producing or commissioned or would see drafts of in most cases. So I call them lifetime illustrations. I've done a little bit on Treasure Island illustrations with Laura Idem, who's done some really good work herself. So the chapter on Treasure Island and the Black Arrow is a really important contribution to moving that discussion forward, because there's so much more to talk about. What I really appreciate about the book and Kate's work is that these fin-de-siècle illustrations, these illustrated texts from the end of the 19th century, to me, and this is what I'm interested in, is there a segue between the highly visual text of the neo-romance and early modern cinema. That's not a particularly new argument, but what I'm interested in is to see how illustration in particular feeds early cinematic imagery. And I think this book really contributes to that. And, some of the illustrations to Rider Haggard's She, I think, really open that up for discussion as well. So I think this is a really interesting and pertinent moment to produce this kind of work. The writing on Wyatt's illustrations, but also Walter Paget, I think, is a really important and not very discussed artist. And I think that's really contributed to the discussion. When you think about all of the titles that Kate's listed and some of the ones that maybe haven't been analysed but are by these authors, and off the top of my head, we've got Treasure Island, Jekyll and Hyde, Kidnapped, War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, The Jungle Book. All these are staples of cinematic interpretation, and that's another reason why I think this particular book and this area of research is so significant, because we're talking about adaptation. So illustration is the first adaptation of any text, especially those that are done during the author's lifetime. But even those done after important illustrations, so Wyatt's illustrations, for example, are done well after Stevenson's death in 1894, which I think is an interesting date because Stevenson dies in 1894, but that's also the same year that I think it's Edison copyrights the first moving image to Sneeze, I think it was. That's a really interesting segue right there. I'm really impressed by the work. I'm very happy to have been able to contribute even just a little bit to it. This book, like every good academic monograph, I think, provides a platform for further discussion. I can't talk with any authority on any of the other chapters, which I'm thoroughly enjoying right now, but I'm learning from it too, which is obviously important. I feel like my own work is meant to build on work that's come before me, and Kate's carrying on that tradition very nicely with this wonderful text. So congratulations. It's a wonderful piece of work, and I think it will be looked at by people like myself and more suitable authorities over the coming years, and I'm just happy to have been a little part of it. Congratulations and enjoy the launch. Well deserved.
Hi, my name is Tobias Wilson-Bates. I'm an assistant professor at Georgia Gwinnett College. I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Holterhoff for having me here to talk about her wonderful chapter, Picturing Machines in H.G. Wells's Scientific Romances. I want to begin by discussing a significant but somewhat forgotten illustrator, Robert Seymour. Seymour, sometimes called the Shakespeare of caricature, was an illustrious artist in the tradition of the vignette, an immensely popular and profitable business in the 18th and 19th centuries, when even somewhat mediocre publications could increase significantly in value if they included simple but striking images. Images helped publishers manipulate copyright law by creating unique editions of older works, and, of equal importance, once the image print had been created, it could be added to multiple texts and sold in separate illustration compilations. If you have ever returned to William Hogarth, or George Cruikshank, or John Tenniel to examine their images' complex mesh of humor, social commentary, and aesthetic expression, then you are already aware of how dynamic this tradition can be. In 1836, Robert Seymour had the profound misfortune to be paired with a ravenously ambitious young writer to produce a series of social vignettes that would be coupled with his trademark drawings. After a series of bitter fights between the two, Seymour burned his work and committed suicide. The writer managed to convince the publisher not to scrap the project immediately, and the result was the Pickwick Papers, one of the most popular texts of the century, and its author, Boz, or as we know him, Charles Dickens, continued to use the same illustration-dependent formula throughout the rest of his works. I bring this up because despite their immense visibility in our collective imagination, illustrations often don't enter into our discussions of these authors and texts. Don't get me wrong, there is excellent work being done on illustration, Linda Hughes, Robert Patton, and Michael Lund, among many others. But often these projects are about recovering the illustrators and illustrations, and don't necessarily extend to accomplishing the task of recovering the emergent meaning of multimodal texts and the laborious collaborations necessary for their production. Dr. Holterhoff's chapter on H.G. Wells does just that. And before touching on some of her most salient points, I want to stress how long overdue such a project is when it comes to Wells. It is a truth so abundantly clear that it's hardly worth articulating that the Wellsian tradition is almost entirely a visual one. Whether his short story Through a Window, that inspired Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, a text about looking that has been central to critical theories of the gaze, or The Long-Legged Invaders of the War of the Worlds, or the play with the seen and the unseen in The Invisible Man, or the extreme proliferation of time machines spawned in the Wellsian time-hopping tradition. We tend to know Wells when we see him, a curious point of fact for a man who made his money creating words rather than images. A quick review of Wells's origin story reveals that he, like Dickens 60 years earlier, also began his career producing multimodal texts. In Wells's case, his early work was producing science textbooks, and the practice of making a scientific concept accessible to a lay audience alongside illustrations would come to define his specific form of science fiction. While much ink has been spilt on Wells's many romantic entanglements, authorial antagonisms, and political philosophy, not nearly enough has been done to trace what he is actually most known for and the particular collaborations and media of its dissemination. In her chapter, Holterhoff illuminates how Wells's tendency to consistently create impoverished descriptions that then motivate visualizations of his ideas led to an atmosphere where his illustrators were both pressured to create his imaginary productions, even while experiencing relative freedom to triangulate scientific journals, contemporary devices, and their own imagination to produce his visual technologies and typographies. Equally impressive is the work Holterhoff's book does to create each level of Wells's conception and collaboration. This includes Wells's own casual illustrations, his correspondence and opinions about various illustrations and illustrators in his works, his interest in selecting illustrators when that work was not done by the editor or the publication, and even the shift in the techniques and technologies of illustrating as the century progressed. What is revealed is twofold. First, what we call H.G. Wells is not merely an individual, but always a name attached to a broader system of collaboration, something like Disney, for example, that should replace the casual founding father mythologies all too frequently relied upon in canon formation and curriculum design. And second, that the multimodality of these texts is not incidental to their meaning, but deeply structurally necessary at the conception to how these stories operate narratively and then socially as they circulate in culture. Holterhoff's work is not just an impressive display of scholarship, but also a model for how such projects can begin to revise the found truths of our field.
Hi, my name is Ian Afflerbach, and I'm Assistant Professor of American Literature at the University of North Georgia. I'm going to be talking about the 5th chapter from Kate's book, entitled A Cannibal Vision, which focuses on James DeMille's posthumous serialized novel, A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. Now, there are all manner of familiar and fun romance tropes involved in this tale. It draws on the notion of the hollow earth, the lost civilization, the endurance of prehistoric creatures, and so on. But the central representational question for this chapter concerns the novel's treatment of cannibalism. Cannibalism, as Kate notes, featured regularly in 19th century transatlantic periodicals, with both fictional and journalistic prose, often accompanied by illustrations that were clearly meant to generate, quote, visceral feelings of disgust and shock in their readers. Writers certainly didn't lack for real-world material at this time. Besides the famous Donna Reed party, Kate notes several other notorious instances of real-world cannibalism, including the wreck of the Essex in 1820, which helped inspire Moby Dick, and the Royal Navy's 1845 polar exploration, led by Captain Franklin. What makes Harper's publication of A Strange Manuscript so interesting, however, is its engagement with the troubling possibility of white cannibalism. Traditionally, Kate explains, scholars have identified written and visual rhetoric surrounding cannibals in the 19th century as a, quote, proxy for European and American racism. Yet the notion of the white cannibal raises potentially scandalous questions and doubts about the supposed civility inherent to white people when compared to non-white people. Kate situates these anxieties within larger intellectual and cultural discourses of the age, including the widespread fear of a degeneracy of the white race through its imperial adventures abroad, as well as the growing deployment of cannibalism as a, quote, metaphor to critique the paired civility and ferocity of domestic politics. The chapter's most striking illustration comes from Gilbert Gall, the American artist who, as a frequent Harper's collaborator, was hired to illustrate DeMille's Strange Manuscript. And here, I'll share this with you very briefly. There it is. Now, whereas incidents, non-white persons feasting on human flesh often featured lurid detail, Kate explains, white cannibalism was repeatedly obscured by euphemistic language. A similar representational modesty presides over this illustration by Gall. Without the context of DeMille's story, she explains, the covered head on the table looks little different from a classical bust or a Roman death mask housed in the British Museum. Only the barest hint of a trickle of blood in the corner of the mouth belies the head's corporeality, unquote. While these pictures obscure more than they reveal, then, this hesitancy precisely signals the vulnerability, fear of white persons violating the bodily self-determination of other white persons. Bodily self-determination, of course, being that cardinal value of the always presumptively white liberal subject. Now, without spoiling all the exegetical fun of this chapter, I want to step back and talk a bit about why I find this whole line of thinking so captivating. One of the stubborn myths in our literary historiography has it that realism arrived and overthrew the fancies and falsities of romance fiction. At the same time, realism allowed for an expansion of the available subject matter for fiction, breaking down of taboos, introducing a concern for the ordinary, the individual, the mundane, an overthrow of representational regimes, to use Jacques Rancière's language. But even as this supposed overthrow was happening, some observers seem to recognize what Kate's book so clearly demonstrates. Romance fiction might actually have been better poised at times to grapple with the limits of what its society deemed representable. In his plea for romantic fiction, Frank Norris, the American writer, wrote that realism, quote, stultifies itself. It is the drama of a broken teacup, the tragedy of a walk down the block. But to romance, he says, belongs the wide world for range and the unplumbed depth of the human heart. White cannibalism seems to me to exemplify what Norris saw as the all but unrepresentable depths of human possibility. And as this chapter so vividly demonstrates, he precisely took romance writers and their illustrators to pry at the bounds of this representational taboo. Thanks very much for listening.
Wonderful. So then maybe people can either unmute themselves or use the chat here to direct their questions to Kate.
Should we wave? Like, hey, I have a question.
Sure. However you want to do it.
So, Kate, my understanding of the postdoctoral book process is like you just take your dissertation and then you turn it into a book, which is always much harder than anyone thinks it's going to be. But my understanding is that is not what this book was. Like, this is a book project, but not your only book project. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, my dissertation is still like languishing with another publisher. So I'm hopeful to get that one out eventually. But no, this was it came out of the publishers at Routledge reached out to me about a series that I sort of publishing in journals about illustrations had alerted them to, you know, maybe the possibility of expanding that line of thinking. So yeah, I had a very good experience working with them and was able to, you know, bang out a book proposal pretty quickly and met with the editors at NAFSA and yeah, I was able to write this, I guess, I don't know, 3 years. But I will say a lot of it had, you know, came out of my long sort of thinking through Visual Haggard. And it was exciting to apply a lot of the stuff that I had seen with that long sort of archival encyclopedic type of work to other authors. You know, you kind of get in the groove of thinking that Haggard might be this sort of exception, and in a lot of ways he is. I think he is an exceptional, you know, person to study in terms of illustration. But there was a lot going on there. So, yeah, so it you know, it was sort of a labor of love, and you know, I should have added in my list of thanks my mother-in-law for watching my children while I, you know, spent time working on this, and it's been you know, kind of I guess something to keep me grounded during these you know, difficult times. Okay, yeah. So Rachel has a question about the animations. Yeah, so you know, I wouldn't claim to be a film historian, but I will say that one of the things that I do talk about is in She. I think it's George Méliès. He created an early film of She or Asha dancing in a fire. And it's called The Pillar of Fire Flame, you know, it's a translation. And it shows this French actress doing a flame dance, you know, and it's, you know, very erotic, but, you know, it reflects the illustrations that Maurice Grievenhagen had created pretty clearly. So yeah, that would probably be the one that I could speak to the most clearly. And a friend of mine at the University of Connecticut had actually written a little bit about that as well in terms of, you know, film history. So, hey, Toby.
Hey, I just had a quick question, and I guess it's sort of, I'm interested in kind of any experiential stuff, having done some archival work on illustrations. You know, it's like, it's one of these found truths that like all film before something like 1928, like 98% of it's lost because that the film didn't age well or became explosive and all this kind of stuff. I was wondering if you have some sense or frustrations or stories about trying to find these illustrations and finding perhaps, and I'm not certain if this is kind of the question, that the vast majority of them are lost or that are ephemeral or something like this, and sort of what that sort of hunting the white whale of illustrations has been like.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I could definitely speak to that. So that's why I really became connected with so many collectors. So there is a Rider Haggard Society. So there, you know, I was very fortunate that the owner of probably what I would consider the most famous illustration of Asha, which is the cover of the book, had reached out to me through that group, permitting me to use that image and while sharing some of his other illustrations with me in the process. So I will say a lot of this information is kind of hidden and you have to know people. And I didn't realize this. So I have corresponded with many collectors over the years. And so yes, with Haggard's work, I have been alerted to a number of different illustrations I had no idea existed. The bibliography of Haggard, Watmore has probably the sort of gold standard of what exists in terms of Haggard text. Like all the different editions are in that, and it is incorrect in many different ways. But it also only reflects just a few of the illustrations, so it's not a very good source for folks hunting illustrations. So yes, I have been searching for I believe 1920s illustration of it's a Wisdom's Daughter. I'm trying to remember. There are some of the later versions of the parts of the She franchise were illustrated in their serial form, and I have not been able to track those down to this day. So yeah, in addition to just learning about illustrations I didn't even know to look for, I know of a few that I haven't been able to find. So I have reached out to the Beinecke at some point, trying to get permission to reproduce things on Visual Haggard, but also, just trying to see if these illustrations even exist, because, sometimes the records are incorrect or I just haven't found them. So yes, there are many, many illustrations that I would love to find. And then I think another aspect of that is finding the original illustrations. So I think what's kind of, I could have done a deep dive on this, but the cover of the book is the original painting by Marty Skriefenhagen, and then the engraving that I showed during the presentation of Asha, the flame ran up her form, looks, remarkably different. There are a lot of changes that are there. So I would say that the lithograph tends to follow a little more closely what we see in these illustrations. So photomechanical, that using that sort of process with during using the halftone form tends to reproduce what we see a little more clearly, or a little more mimetically. It's kind of one for one, but yeah, with that particular illustration, there's quite a bit of difference. And I think it makes sense that comes from the 1880s. So, as we move into the 20th century, they tended to just take pictures, and that's why we're so familiar with the halftone, the dots, the tracking down the original illustrations would also be a fun sort of side project. And I tend to find them sort of organically, where collectors reach out to me, or vendors. There's been a few times where the folks have wanted me to purchase their illustrations, and I'm afraid I don't have deep enough pockets for that. But it's neat to see them. They send me the scans of what some of those look like. So so that's kind of cool. But yeah, I think it's a lifetime journey trying to track those down. So yeah, so that's been kind of some of my fun experience with that. But I think any of the authors that I deal with in that book you could do a similar project. You could have a visual Wells, a visual Stevenson. All of these probably merit their own website and their own sort of niche collectors. I'm sure Stevenson would, because he is. I would say that there's probably more illustration available for him, especially with Treasure Island. My goodness, it's been illustrated again and again and again. You might get into some copyright issues because they continue to be illustrated. I think even Becky, who's here, could probably speak to some of that. But yeah, that's certainly one that would open up. I don't think there's quite as many DeMille fans, running around, but who knows? I mean, that's what's fun about finding collectors, is that the interests are vast. But it definitely expanded out from my kind of academic realm of concern. That I was used to. Yeah, I relied on my interlibrary loan access. But there's a whole world outside of that, of folks who have this deep knowledge about what exists, and they're excited to tell you about it. So it's there's a lot of work to be done in illustration studies, and I think it's a lot of fun.
Kate, could you share if you have a favorite illustration that appears in the book and why it's your favorite illustration?
Oh, that's so hard. you know what, as I was writing it, it would always be the one that I'm writing about at that time. But I mean, I guess I just have to go with the cover image. I love it. Maurice Griefenhagen is by far my favorite illustrator. I actually own one. I thought about hanging it behind me during this talk. I didn't do that, I apologize. But, and it's not from a Haggard story. Again, I can't afford those. The Haggard fans are too ravenous for me. But, you know, it's for a book called The Gray Cloak, I believe, which I haven't read. I feel bad. But anyways, he's a sort of wonderful later 19th century Royal Academy artist, but really worked in a sort of pre-Raphaelite style. And a lot of folks don't like his women, which I think is very interesting, considering that he was so well known for illustrating Asha over and over again. I mean, you know, so he illustrated about 12 of Haggard's books. So if you go into Visual Haggard, you can see many of his works. And so the site is divided by illustrator as well as novel. So you can kind of, you know, divvy that up as you will. But you'll see that he just appears over and over again. And he and Haggard were very good friends as well. So, you know, my love of H. Rider Haggard sort of intersects with my love of Griefenhagen in a very organic way. And Griefenhagen even named his son, his middle name was Rider. So they, you know, worked closely together and also had a very close, you know, personal relationship. So they, I would say probably, you know, I could go with anything by him, but yeah, let's do the sort of most canonical work, you know, the Fire Runs Up Perform.
I have a question, Kate. I have been so enjoying all of this, but question for you, just putting you on the spot. I know that Stevenson, in his letters, especially to his cousin Bob, who's a very noted art critic later on, he's constantly whining and complaining about illustrators that he has not handpicked. And he's just like, this person's brushwork is terrible. This person has no concept of the text. I don't trust him. He goes on and on and on and on and on, like throughout his entire career. So I'm just curious, did other people that you're writing on in this book also kind of moan about their illustrators in the same way, and
without exception,
as voluminously? Okay.
Probably not as voluminously as Stevenson, but they all had their different sort of interests. So I would say like Wells loved humor. So he always was sort of attracted to the comic versions of his story. But yeah, Haggard hated the illustrations for, I think, the Brethren. He disliked those in particular. And he probably disliked other illustrators. I mean, it's such an interesting history. Yeah, so but yeah, all of them disliked different illustrators. And Kipling, for instance, you know, his father Lockwood was an artist and an illustrator for several of his books. So he had very profound opinions, illustrated his own works on occasion. And you know, so he had very for To My the Elephants, he kept rejecting different artists and like suggesting them, which was very uncommon and frowned upon. But he was such a celebrity that they wanted to make him happy, so they had to deal with his, you know, requesting certain you know, artists and then, you know, having them back out and you know, so it was, I get into that one in particular. But yeah, they all expressed opinions about illustration, and you know, it's kind of fun to make try to guess at how they felt. So I can give you one where you know, example, of course, H. Rider Haggard again, but I thought it was fascinating that I could only ever find one female illustrator of any Haggard work. And, you know, I felt like pretty confident that I'd seen a lot of them, most of them, maybe all of them. And I said, so it was really unclear to me, because were so many female illustrators, why that would be. And I've really speculated about, you know, where that came, what's the history of that. And it was interesting. I encountered a letter where he actually offered to a female artist to let her look at some of his, you know, to give her a chance at illustrating his work. And I don't know what happened with that, you know, but it's interesting that the only one that I know of is Amy Sawyer, who I've written a chapter for a collected book that's coming out soon on her in particular. but it kind of makes you speculate, like, are there certain qualities of illustrators that they like, or is it just, sort of superficial things, or, do they want to just give these jobs to their friends, or is it, or do they leave it completely in the hands of the publisher and the art editor? It's extremely interesting, but yeah, they all do it. So, and I believe that I comment on that in every chapter, I'm pretty sure. So except for DeMille, again, because his work was published posthumously. So that one is the exception. That's kind of the odd chapter out. That's why I needed the most help with that. I think as a someone who pretends to be an Americanist on occasion, I sent that one off to American periodicals so that they could tell me where I was wrong, and then also lean on my my good friend Ian, so for pointing out my when I'm going astray. But yeah, it's certainly I think I could have spoke more about the French illustrations too, but I don't again, there's so many rabbit holes with illustration studies, and I look forward to other people writing more about this, especially in the romance form. And it just is there's so much, and I think so far realist fictions have really been the most common in terms of what people have written about.
I have a question, a follow up on that distinction. Part of what I kind of hinted at this at the end of the video blurb, but part of what I find so fascinating about romance fiction is its political wildness, that so much of the kind of familiar liberal middle class ideology at work in realist fiction. Romance can be all over the place, for better and often for worse. And so I'm wondering if you found other experiences like chapter 5, where the task of illustrating kind of amplifies the political stakes of the stories, or maybe going in the opposite direction, where you found that the process of illustration forced an author or an illustrator to kind of swerve away from the late political tensions in a story.
Well, I will say that the illustrators were often forced to conform to the most middle ground, ostensibly apolitical, version of things. So they tended to, preference any, the illustrations of someone who would diminish that. But it's interesting, of course, now where everything is political, we see a lot of, and then I'd say that the chapter on Haggard gets into this the sort of post-colonial lens and the racist illustrations, the fact that women are portrayed in these extremely, problematic ways, those are the sort of political things that I think we're seeing now. But they were considered, we can bring the word Grundyism here, right? The illustrators the illustrations that accompanied works tended to be, to eschew politics as much as possible. So I would say that I think they would be just kind of across the board. They didn't want to bring in that element. They wanted to appeal to the broadest audience. And so there is a perceived reader who was always, white, male, Anglo-American, that they're middle class, that all those qualities, pro-imperialism were brought together. And so that, it flattens the sort of perception of how these texts should be read in ways that I think the authors would have been sort of unhappy with. And I think that comes through in Wells pretty clearly. I saw that especially because he loves humor so much. So with a lot of the choices that these authors make of their own accord, they bring politics back in. So I think, again, in terms of the iterative history being so important, I'd say that later illustrations can sometimes be more politically, illuminating than maybe the first ones, the ones that came out in the serial edition. So, things like Pearson's magazine, Wells hated a lot of the illustrations that accompanied those early editions, and like begged for the Invisible Man to not be illustrated, for instance.
So if you had to write, say, like a follow-up chapter are there any authors that you would include or specific illustrators, or if you had to add more stuff, not that you should have added more stuff, your book is perfect as it is, but how would you extend it?
Oh gosh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, in the beginning I did think about other authors that I could have included. That's really interesting. Well, I think what I have thought, a way that I could frame a sort of similar project that would maybe highlight different aspects would be, instead of focusing on an author necessarily, focus on different publications. So yeah, I brought up Pearson's as being important. And I think you can even kind of group certain periodicals together. So the Illustrated London News, and then Harper's Weekly. I talk about Harper's more than I anticipated. I mean, it just kept coming up. And maybe the different formats. So, I've been learning quite a bit about print history. So the sort of large newspaper format, the way the illustrations would come across in those, versus the sort of magazines that would be a little more compact. I would say that those might be some interesting approaches. Also, the intended audience. So Haggard, again, on this sort of gender issue, even though he considered his works to be books for boys, same with Stevenson, in fact, many of Haggard's stories were published in periodicals for women. So like Atlanta and the Women's Home magazine, just things you wouldn't expect. So I would think a periodical focused project might kind of shine light on some different approaches to this. Yeah, I guess I'd have to think more about other authors. They're not jumping out at me. But let's see. Yeah, I don't know. Let me think on that one.
I like the format angle, if that helps. I think that's a good answer.
Yeah, it's one that I'm certainly mulling over. It just kept coming up, and I kept seeing these sort of patterns. So yeah, I mean, I kind of mentioned in the beginning that like the way that Pearson's cropped illustrations was very different than how like the Cosmopolitan did, which you wouldn't think to look for it, but then suddenly, because I'm just spending all this time with it, I'm like, oh my gosh, the War of the Worlds looks totally different in the American serialized edition than it did to British audiences. Who knew? So anyway, yeah.
I'm just wondering, I don't know if I heard you say this or not, but are there illustrations that you feel like still could come to light or are missing by some of these authors? I mean, I just wondered how you determine when you've seen everything that exists, or will you ever be at that point?
I don't think we'll ever know for sure. Like I said, most canonical authors have a bibliography that's pretty substantial. So I mentioned Watmore being the one for Haggard. And so that will list a number of illustrated editions. But again, I kept finding these errors, and I think what was interesting to me too is I didn't realize, like, so for instance, She, everyone talks about the graphics version of She, and that was what I really was familiar with. For instance, the Broadview edition of She has reproduces the illustrations from that. So that's the E.K. Johnson illustrations. Well, it turns out at the exact same time that was serialized, it appeared in Harper's. I had no idea, like, and it's nowhere. Like I don't even know how I forget now how I found that out, but it was just remarkable to me, and no one talks about that. And they, as far as I'm recalling, there's no differences in the way the illustrations appear there, and it probably has to do with the fact that it's the sort of newspaper format. But that sort of information just doesn't exist. So no, I would say that there's no way that we can know for sure. There's things that I know I haven't been able to find, and I've tried to reach out to find them. So I'm recalling these sort of later. I think it might be actually Pearson's, but yeah, I could follow up with this information later. But there are some Asha illustrations that I would love to get my hands on and haven't been able to. They tend to be later though. I think maybe it's just the amount of illustrations just kept increasing and increasing, especially in the early years of the 20th century. So yeah, a number of those are missing, and I really can't speak authoritatively about some of the other authors. I know the most about Haggard, so I kind of knew these trends to look for. But I would never get up and say this is all the illustrations that exist. I would that would be a terrible misstep, I think, for anyone. They just keep appearing, and even so Andrew Stouffer was the one who edited the Broadview edition of She. He and I, talked about how there was actually an earlier American edition, illustrated edition of She, and he wasn't familiar with it. So I think that there's just always information that's out there, and you don't always know to ask for it. So yeah, so that would be my best answer for that. Just don't ever say that that's all the illustrations, because you're probably wrong. So Rachel says, I'm curious if you had any interesting insights in the style of the illustrators. Yeah, how did their art stay consistent across? Yeah, great question. Yes, definitely. I spend a fair bit of time comparing the illustrations in the style of the illustrations to fine art examples and to sort of larger trends throughout the book. So for instance, Lockwood Kipling has a sort of wonderful flat style that he is basing on some of his pre-Raphaelite inspiration. And then I talk a little bit about the symbolist movement, both in America and in Europe. I actually spent a fair amount of time talking about symbolism, which again was not an art movement that I was particularly familiar with beforehand, but it just kept coming up in terms of trying to condense ineffable ideas into these sort of broadly marketed, middle brow containers. Like it's really interesting to get these paratexts that accompanied these again wild-minded fictions had to condense a lot of ideas. And so the way that they tended to do that was they looked to fine art movements or to other sources. So I look at illustration, I look at advertisements, theater, and blueprints. Even I showed one of those briefly where H.G. Wells, when he was inspired by the Diplocks, pre whatever it is, tread, for tanks in the land ironclads. So and so illustrators would have had to be familiar with a number of different sources. So style, definitely the fine art aspect of that comes through in, I dig into that in the text, in the monograph particularly, but I think it's also important to have these sort of lower brow references in mind when you're thinking about illustration history. It's really fun because a lot of these illustrators just didn't have a lot to work with, and it kind of differed on how that would look. So a lot of illustration studies has to do with the word and image, and this dichotomy of how do you represent something in both ways. And so these things, there's a long history of this. The Laocoon, the sister arts. I'm not the first person to deal with this in any manner, but I think it's really interesting to think through illustrations with that lens, because the romance form in particular just really had a lot of innovative ways of grappling with that. So the Kipling chapter I think is a lot of fun because it talks about speaking animals as a way of dealing with that the sort of multimodal and yet impossible journey of trying to figure out how do we show an animal speaking, like how do we visualize speech, and that's obviously impossible. But if we lean on other things that are known, we can show these sort of unshowable aspects, and then things get very heady and philosophical. But I think it's a lot of fun though. I mean, Kipling of course was writing for children, and so his way of dealing with that is tends to be a little more lighthearted, and he like Wells in a lot of ways really preferred more caricature style, this sort of playful approach to these ideas. So so I think that kind of touches on it. Again, there's most of the chapters do bring in a little bit of fine art. I actually didn't include the NCY. That is, I think, a really interesting example where it really crosses the line between fine art and illustration, because of course he is such an accomplished painter. But he was well known for his illustrations. So, but the copyright restrictions, convinced me to leave that for the book. So but they're, the illustrations that NCY created for Treasure Island are considered some of the best, and they're hanging in a museum right now. So the Brandywine. So that I think is kind of a good example of how some of these illustrations are really not to be they're not just ephemeral, they're not just meant to be discarded, but they really are pulling from a long tradition of art history, and the quality is just, it's there. These aren't just throwaway things in on poor quality newspaper. They're meant to be treasured.
So quick question for you, Kate. So I'm curious as to the last question, actually your answer was a perfect segue, in the sense that one of the things that I'm curious about is sort of the modern equivalents, in the sense that, and apologies, I had to take a call earlier, so if you were to answer this, by all means. But I'm very curious, like if we think about the predecessor to a lot of the sort of pulp fiction, right, was the serialized fiction that we're talking about here, right? So H. Rider Haggard and many of his contemporaries gave way to the pulp fiction writers of sort of the following century and so on, and they have given way to some degree to, I guess, sort of narrative podcasts in many cases, right? So there's a ton of quote unquote sort of pulp material in podcasts today. So setting aside like the exact sort of path here, I'm curious from your perspective, is there anything that you look at today that's the equivalent from an illustrative standpoint, right? Because in other words, if the podcasts are the successor, in most cases, they're not a company, the visual art is irrelevant, to the medium. So where does that art live these days? Like what's the modern equivalent of this?
Yeah, well, I would say graphic novels and Marvel movies, definitely. When I taught this at universities, I would send my students to see. I'm thinking of this is so many years ago now. Jumanji, one of the modern adaptations of Jumanji with The Rock. I had my students watch that because that really has a lot of Haggardian, is that a word? Qualities to it. So that even though it it sort of erases a lot of the problematic racist, sexist, imperialist aspects that are so prominent in Haggard's writing, you still have this sense of like, well, where is this Jumanji place? Oh, it's Africa. Well, where are the Africans? I don't know. And it's of course extremely lush and visual, and so that sort of over the top CGI. Totally outrageous conception of adventure. I think it very much is coming from this tradition of illustration. I also think that there's a lot of realism there where if you think of the early 20th century as being the sort of beginnings of modernism, and we're moving into abstract expressionism and non-objective art, the middle brow marketed serial formed romance type of fictions are very much still in that camp of beautiful representational artworks. So the other example that I like to give is from the Marvel movies. If you pause a Marvel movie at any time, the way that the forms are just twisting, and there's this sort of serpentine quality to a lot of the fight scenes, very much looks like a Haggard illustration. I would say it is deeply indebted to that history, and I would be surprised if many of the animation specialists there, the folks who are kind of creating the storyboards, weren't inspired by the illustrations themselves. So again, this is sort of a chapter that needs to be written, but I see it there. There's been the slow-mo fight scenes, especially. I mean, it's almost like they want to pause that so that you can just completely take in this sort of beautiful like tornado of bodies and violence and good-looking people and hair flying, and I don't know, just the whole outrageousness of the whole thing. This is just comes straight from 19th century illustrations. So yes, I see that. I see the line very clearly. I think you're right that it came from the pulps in a lot of ways. I talk a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft in the text, so that's kind of a nice transition there, because of course he was very interested in what cannot be spoken, the ineffable, and Of course, he had more of a Gothic take, and I'm a little more agnostic with my view of that. I don't think it necessarily has to deal with horror. I think that there's lots of ways that these romance authors were thinking through what can't be spoken. But yeah, it's definitely there. I think that the fact that it's trying to reach that middle brow audience is another aspect of it too. But yeah, in terms of where to look, any Marvel movie, any of them, they're just like 19th century illustrations.
Awesome, thanks.
All right. Well, this has been so lovely. Thank you so much for coming to my book launch. I'm so excited that this was so well attended. This is just wonderful. So first book, it just means the world to me to have my friends here to celebrate it with me. So any final thoughts we can. Oh, thanks, Sarah.
Congratulations, Kate.
Thank you. Yes, I'm excited. I'm going to celebrate with the family here. It's too bad that we can't all be enjoying cocktails together at a sort of normal book launch event, but this is wonderful because I get to see so many friendly faces. So thank you, Dori, for putting this on. Andy, representing Georgia Tech. It's wonderful to have this sort of support. So all right, I will hopefully speak with you all soon. So yeah, thank you. Bye.